Detective Mark Lawson had always considered himself a man grounded in facts, logic, and an unwavering belief that every mystery had an explanation, some mundane, some complex, but always explainable. But as he sat behind the wheel of his aging cruiser, the rain battering the windshield like a relentless drum, he couldn't shake the feeling that this case would be different. The call had come just as dusk bled into night, a dispatch from a tiny mountain town deep in the Appalachians, Hollow Creek. The dispatcher's voice was hesitant, almost strained. Several people had disappeared over the past month, each vanishing without a trace. No ransom notes, no demands, no signs of struggle. Just silence and the whispered fear of a town too small and isolated to hide its darkest secrets. Mark ran a hand through his damp hair, his fingers trembling slightly as he pressed the radio down. "I'm on it," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. The road to Hollow Creek was narrow and winding, carved through dense forests that seemed to close in on either side. As his headlights cut through the fog, Mark's mind drifted to the warnings he'd heard before arriving, tales of restless spirits, curses as old as the hills, and the presence of something the locals simply called the Hollow Man superstitions, he thought. But the unease lingered. When Mark finally pulled into town just after midnight, he was met with a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. Streetlights flickered like dying stars, and the air smelled damp, earthy, and faintly metallic, a scent he couldn't place but instinctively found unsettling. His first stop was the town's police office, a small, weathered building that looked as old as the town itself. Sheriff Reynolds was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with lines carved deep into his face and eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. Detective Lawson, the sheriff, greeted him, voice gravelly. "Glad you're here. We're at our wits' end." Mark nodded. "Walk me through what you've got." Reynolds handed him a file thick with reports, photos, and statements from terrified residents. The disappearances spanned a range of ages, teenagers, adults, even an elderly woman. No pattern, no motive. Only one detail repeated: each victim was last seen near the edges of the woods or close to the old mine on the outskirts of town. "The mine's been closed for years," Reynolds said. "But no one's been able to explain why people keep vanishing around there. Some say it's cursed. Others say it's something else." Mark frowned. "Something else?" The sheriff's eyes darkened. "The Hollow Man. An old legend. Some say it's a spirit, others think it's a demon. But everyone around here fears it." Mark dismissed the notion with a polite nod, but he kept the name in mind as he left to visit the scene. The mine was a gaping wound on the landscape, a rusted gate hanging from broken hinges, and the scent of rotten earth hung thick in the air. Mark's flashlight barely penetrated the shadows inside the tunnel mouths. The walls were slick with moisture, and somewhere deep beneath the surface, he thought he could hear the faint drip of water, or something worse. As he moved deeper, his light caught something odd: strange carvings etched into the rock, twisted faces with hollow eyes, mouths frozen in silent screams. He crouched, tracing the marks with a gloved finger. They were old, decades at least, but fresh in a way, as if someone had been adding to them recently. Mark's skin prickled with a cold he couldn't explain. Suddenly, a soft sound echoed in the darkness, a whisper carried on the stale air. He froze. "Who's there?" His voice was low, cautious. No answer. Just the whisper of the wind. Mark left the mine quickly, the hairs on his neck standing tall. Outside, the fog was thickening, curling around trees like ghostly fingers. As he drove back to town, his mind raced with possibilities. The disappearances weren't random. They weren't accidents. Something was lurking in the shadows of Hollow Creek, something patient and hungry. Back at the sheriff's office, Mark pored over the files again. One of the reports caught his eye, a torn piece of a journal found near the last victim's home. The writing was frantic, filled with descriptions of shadows moving just beyond the edge of vision, strange figures watching from the trees, and repeated mentions of a name, the Hollow Man. Mark's heart pounded as he read the last line, scrawled in shaky handwriting. He waits beneath. The shadows will claim us all. As the clock struck 3, Mark realized he hadn't felt this kind of dread in years. He wasn't just chasing a missing persons case anymore. He was chasing a nightmare. The morning sun barely pierced the thick canopy of pines surrounding Hollow Creek, but the town was already awake, moving with a wary, slow rhythm. Detective Mark Lawson spent a restless night in a worn motel on Main Street, haunted by dreams of shadows slipping through the forest and a cold presence watching him from the darkness. He was up early, fueled by a restless drive to uncover the truth. Outside, the fog clung stubbornly to the ground, swirling like restless spirits as he stepped toward the creek itself, a sluggish, muddy ribbon that wound its way silently through the dense woods. The water was stained a dull, unnatural gray, and the air smelled faintly of iron and decay. Mark knelt by the bank and dipped a gloved hand into the water. It was cold to the bone, far colder than the autumn air should allow. Nearby, a cluster of old trees bore the strange carvings he had glimpsed in the mine, twisted faces, eyes gouged deep, mouths open as if screaming in silent agony. Some were crudely etched, others finely detailed, as though the work of different hands in different times. The locals called them the watching marks. Mark ran his fingers over the bark, a shiver crawling down his spine. What were these symbols? And who was carving them, especially now, amid the disappearances? He drove toward the abandoned mine again, this time with a clearer goal, to search the perimeter for any signs missed the night before. The mine had been shut for nearly 50 years, ever since a catastrophic collapse buried several miners alive, an event the townsfolk spoke of only in whispers. As he approached the rusted gate, Mark noticed fresh footprints in the soft earth, small, barefoot impressions that led into the woods and vanished under the fallen leaves. Something about them disturbed him. They seemed too light, too fleeting, as if they belonged to someone not quite human. He followed the trail cautiously, his flashlight ready despite the creeping daylight. The forest grew denser here, the trees older and twisted like ancient sentinels guarding secrets no man was meant to find. The footprints stopped abruptly at a circle of stones arranged unnaturally, like a crude altar. At the center lay a bundle wrapped in a torn cloth. Mark's pulse quickened as he peeled it open. Inside was a small, weathered journal, its pages brittle and stained. The handwriting was jagged and hurried, the ink smeared as if the writer had been trembling violently. Flipping through the pages, Mark read fragments of a terrified confession. I hear it whispering in the dark, the Hollow Man calls my name. It hides beneath the earth, beneath the creek, waiting for the right moment to drag us all down with it. The faces in the trees watch, and if you look too long, they come alive. I saw them move, eyes burning like coals. Mark's stomach churned. The writer had been a miner, one of the few survivors from the collapse, it seemed. The last entry was dated 2 days before the first disappearance. That evening, Mark returned to the town diner, hoping to glean more from the locals. The patrons were tight-lipped, exchanging glances that spoke volumes. A woman in her 60s, with sharp eyes and a voice roughened by years of smoking, leaned in when she noticed Mark's badge. You're poking around where you shouldn't, she warned. That mine, it's cursed, sure as hell. But it's more than that. The Hollow Man's real. Took my boy last month. He went into the woods, chasing a shadow, and never came back. Mark nodded silently, swallowing the lump rising in his throat. Folks say the Hollow Man's not just a ghost, she continued, voice dropping to a whisper. He's something older. Something that's been under that ground since long before the mine. He can change shape, get inside your head. Makes you see things that ain't there, or worse, makes you forget who you are. Mark left the diner with a heavy heart, the woman's words echoing in his mind. That night, back in his motel room, the walls seemed to close in. The wind outside howled like a beast in pain, and shadows danced behind the curtains. Sleep was elusive. Mark's dreams twisted into a surreal nightmare, a forest where trees bled, faces screamed silently from the bark, and a tall figure with hollow eyes and a jagged grin beckoned him into the darkness. When he woke, his phone buzzed with a text from Sheriff Reynolds, "Meet me at Miriam's." Now, Miriam was the town's historian, a recluse who many said knew every dark secret Hollow Creek held. Mark's gut told him this meeting could be crucial or dangerous. As Mark approached Miriam's weather-beaten house on the edge of town, he noticed the air grew colder, heavier, as if the woods themselves were watching. Miriam opened the door before he could knock, her piercing gaze cutting straight through him. "You've seen the carvings," she said without preamble. Mark nodded. "And I've read the journal. There's more going on here than I imagined." Miriam gestured him inside. The house smelled of old books, incense, and something faintly metallic, the same scent Mark had noticed near the creek in the mine. "The Hollow Man is real," she confirmed grimly. Elias Hollow was a miner who died in that collapse. But his death wasn't the end. Something took hold of him, a darkness that twisted his soul and bound him to this land. He became a creature of shadow, feeding on fear, despair, and the souls of the lost. Mark listened, spellbound. He can't leave the land, but he can reach out through the shadows, through the fears of those who wander too close. That's why people vanish near the mine and the creek. The forest is his domain. Miriam handed Mark a small iron pendant, heavy and cold in his palm. "This talisman," she explained, "is said to repel his influence. It's old, forged from the mine's iron. Use it if you must enter the darkness. But be warned, the more you look for him, the less you'll trust what your eyes tell you." Mark felt a sudden weight settle on his chest. This wasn't just a missing persons case. This was a battle against something ancient, terrible, and relentless. As he left Miriam's, the sky darkened unnaturally fast. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, chilling whisper that seemed to follow him home. Mark didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window, clutching the talisman, watching the woods where the shadows moved with a terrible life of their own. And somewhere beyond the trees, something watched back. The sun barely rose over Hollow Creek before Detective Mark Lawson was already in the thick of it, moving through the forest with an intensity he hadn't known he could summon. The talisman Miriam had given him hung heavy around his neck, an iron weight against his chest, a constant reminder of the thin line between reality and nightmare he was walking. The footprints from the previous day had vanished, swallowed by last night's rain, but the oppressive silence of the woods was louder than ever. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed to have retreated, leaving Mark alone with the thick shadows and the memory of those twisted faces carved into bark and stone. He checked his flashlight, adjusted his jacket, and pressed deeper toward the old mine's entrance. Every step felt like a descent not just into the earth, but into a place where time and logic unraveled. Mark's breath came in steady, measured bursts, but inside, a gnawing dread clawed at his gut. The further he went, the stronger the feeling of being watched grew, not by any human, but by something ancient and patient. Halfway there, he stumbled upon a small clearing he hadn't noticed before. It was littered with scraps of fabric, broken glass, and, most disturbingly, a few scattered bones, bleached white and cracked. His stomach turned. These weren't animal remains. A sudden rustle in the bushes made Mark spin, flashlight beam cutting sharply through the darkness. Nothing but shadows. He forced himself to breathe and moved on, heart hammering. When he reached the mine's entrance, the gate was no longer just hanging loosely, it had been torn off entirely, dragged aside with violent force. This place was no longer abandoned. Something was here, waiting. Mark took a deep breath and stepped inside. The air inside was thick, suffocating, a stagnant blend of earth, rot, and something else, something metallic and bitter. His flashlight illuminated walls dripping with moisture, carved symbols and faces leering back at him with hollow eyes. They weren't just carvings anymore, some had shifted since his last visit, grotesque shapes twisting unnaturally. A faint whisper echoed through the tunnel, so soft he almost doubted it was real. "Mark." His head snapped toward the sound. The voice was distant but unmistakably his own name, a voice warped, unnatural. "Who's there?" he whispered, heart thudding. No answer, just that faint, insidious whisper again, barely audible. Mark's fingers tightened around the talisman. Suddenly, the tunnel walls seemed to pulse, shadows stretching and twisting. He stepped forward, deeper into the abyss. The floor beneath his feet gave way unexpectedly, and Mark fell, plunging into darkness. He landed hard, breath knocked out of him, in a narrow, damp shaft, cold mud and water seeping through the cracks. Panic surged, but he forced himself to calm down. He was trapped. His flashlight flickered. The only light now was a faint, eerie glow from deeper within the shaft, a sickly greenish hue that seemed to emanate from the rock itself. Cautiously, Mark rose and followed the light, descending further into the bowels of the earth. The tunnel opened into a vast cavern, its ceiling lost in darkness. Strange, ancient symbols adorned the walls, glowing faintly in the eerie light. In the center of the cavern was a pit, black and bottomless, from which the sickly light seemed to pour. Mark approached the edge, peering down into the abyss. The darkness seemed to pulse, alive, and from it came that whisper again, not a voice, but a chorus of agonized wails and broken promises. He clutched the talisman tighter as a cold breeze rose from the pit, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of iron and decay. Suddenly, movement caught his eye. From the shadows, a figure emerged, tall and gaunt, with skin like cracked bark and eyes like hollow pits of nothingness. The Hollow Man. Mark's breath froze. The creature's smile was a jagged slash, impossible and inhuman. "Why do you come here?" it hissed, voice like the grinding of stones. Mark tried to speak but found his throat dry, words caught like thorns. The creature stepped closer, shadows crawling up its limbs like living smoke. "I seek the lost," Mark finally managed. "The missing people. What have you done to them?" The Hollow Man's grin widened. "They belong to me now, trapped beneath the earth, in the shadows. Their fear feeds me, their despair binds me. You will join them." Mark felt an icy grip around his heart, the talisman burning hot against his skin. With a surge of desperate strength, he raised the iron pendant and shouted, "Begone!" The creature recoiled, a terrible shriek ripping through the cavern. Shadows writhed and screamed as the light from the talisman flared, casting the cavern into blinding white. When Mark opened his eyes, the Hollow Man was gone. But the pit still breathed darkness. Breathing heavily, Mark knew this was only the beginning. Back above ground, the air felt thin, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Mark staggered from the mine entrance, drenched in sweat, heart pounding like a drumbeat of warning. The talisman's iron surface was scalding hot against his palm, pulsing with an energy that both comforted and terrified him. The world around him seemed off. Colors were muted, the trees whispering in languages he couldn't understand. Every shadow stretched longer than it should, every rustle was a threat. Mark's phone buzzed violently, a text from Sheriff Reynolds. "We found something at the creek. You need to see this." He forced his legs to move faster, driven by equal parts dread and necessity. At the creek's edge, a small crowd had gathered. The sheriff, grim-faced, held out a plastic evidence bag containing a fragment of torn fabric stained dark with something that didn't look like blood. Next to him, a local teenager shook uncontrollably. "I found this near where Sarah went missing," the kid whispered, voice cracking. And there was something else. A voice. It called me by name. Said it's waiting for me. Mark's skin crawled. Sarah was the latest victim, the young woman who'd vanished without a trace 2 nights ago. The town was spiraling into panic. Rumors of cults, curses, and possession spread like wildfire. Mark's own reflection in the creek's water caught his eye, gaunt, haunted, his eyes sunken and rimmed with dark circles. He had been chasing shadows so long he was beginning to question if they were real or figments of his unraveling mind. That night, sleep remained a stranger. Mark sat by the motel window, the talisman cold now but throbbing faintly. His mind raced with fragments of what he'd seen in the cavern, the hollow man's twisted form, the endless pit, the whispers. He pulled out the journal again, poring over every page. The miner's terrified scribbles made less sense than before, tangled in madness and pain. One phrase stood out, written in shaky script. Do not trust your eyes, do not trust your thoughts. The hollow man is inside us all. A cold wave crashed through Mark's heart. What if the creature wasn't just outside, but inside? Suddenly, a noise at the door, a soft knock, hesitant. Mark grabbed his flashlight and opened it slowly. No one. Only a folded note slipped inside, heavy with the scent of damp earth and iron. He unfolded it, hands trembling. The hollow man knows your name. He walks beside you, in your reflection, in the corners of your mind. Beware the mirror's truth. His breath caught. Mark's gaze snapped to the small mirror hanging by the dresser. For a long moment, he stared. The reflection stared back, but then, just at the edge, a flicker. A shadow moving independently of his own. He blinked. Gone. A sudden crash from the bathroom made him spin. The door slammed shut. He forced it open, nothing inside but the cracked porcelain sink. But on the mirror was now a message, smeared in something dark. You cannot hide. Mark's heartbeat thundered. He gripped the talisman tight, feeling its ancient power stir once more. He was no longer just a detective chasing a case. He was a hunted man. The hollow man's reach was growing. And the darkest truth was yet to come. Days blurred into restless nights as Mark found himself sinking deeper into the abyss of Hollow Creek's horrors. The town was crumbling under the weight of fear, neighbors no longer greeted each other, and windows were shuttered tight by sundown. The missing piled up, but the official search yielded nothing but cold earth and silence. Mark's investigation had turned inward. The lines between his waking hours and nightmares thinned. Every reflection was a threat, every shadow, a potential doorway for the hollow man to reach inside. The talisman pulsed irregularly now, sometimes burning with fierce heat, other times cold and heavy, like it was responding to something beyond Mark's understanding. One night, compelled by a force he could neither resist nor explain, Mark returned to the abandoned church on the outskirts of town. Its once grand stained glass windows were shattered, pews rotted, and the altar covered in dust and strange symbols etched in blood. Inside, a chilling silence swallowed his footsteps. Mark's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shapes that seemed to move just beyond the beam. At the altar, he found an old leather-bound book, its pages yellowed, written in a script both ancient and disturbingly familiar. Flipping through it, Mark realized it was a ledger of names, all those who had vanished from Hollow Creek over the decades. Next to each name, a symbol matching the carvings in the mine and on the trees. At the very bottom, his own name was scrawled, fresh and red. A sudden whisper echoed from the shadows, low and guttural. You cannot escape what you are. Mark spun around. The room was empty, but the air was thick with something malevolent. He clutched the talisman, feeling it thrumming like a heartbeat. The hollow man was not just a creature of flesh and shadow, it was a curse, a parasite feeding on fear and despair, passing from soul to soul like a dark contagion. Mark's mind reeled as fragmented memories surfaced, moments he couldn't explain, waking up with scratches on his arms, dreams of falling into endless pits, faces screaming in silence. He realized with horror that the Hollow Man had been inside him all along, waiting for the right moment to claim control. His reflection in the shattered stained glass flickered, morphing into a twisted grin, eyes black pits of void. Mark felt a cold hand close around his heart. A voice, not his own, whispered, "Join us, or be lost forever." Desperation surged. Mark raised the talisman and shouted, "Not today." Light exploded, shattering shadows, and for a moment, the air cleared. But the fight was far from over. Mark knew the Hollow Man was not just a monster in the mine or forest, it was a darkness inside every soul it touched, and to save Hollow Creek, he'd have to confront the darkest parts of himself. The night was suffocating. Hollow Creek's sky, once dotted with stars, had blackened to an endless void, as if the heavens themselves were recoiling from the darkness creeping through the town's veins. Detective Mark Lawson stood before the cracked mirror in his motel room, the talisman heavy around his neck, his reflection fractured and distorted like a shattered soul. The voice from the mine, the whisper in the church, the haunting laughter of the Hollow Man, it all echoed inside him. His mind was no longer his own battlefield, it was the battleground. Every instinct screamed to run, to escape the madness, but Mark knew there was no running from this. The Hollow Man had burrowed inside his thoughts, twisted his fears, and now waited for the final moment to consume him whole. The talisman burned fiercely against his skin, its iron cold and searing at once. He raised it before the mirror, the dim light flickering as shadows writhed behind the glass. And then, the mirror cracked further, deep spiderweb fractures spidering out like veins. From the fractures, a darkness seeped, a blackness alive and hungry, crawling into the room like smoke. Mark's reflection smiled first, slowly, cruelly, its eyes deep pits of nothingness, voids that pulled at Mark's sanity. The Hollow Man's grin was there, twisted and impossible. Mark tried to scream but no sound escaped. The room grew cold, his breath visible in frosted clouds. A whisper echoed, thousands of voices layered into one. "You are already ours." Mark's heart pounded like a war drum, every beat echoing the crushing weight of inevitability. The talisman flared once more, and he slammed it into the mirror's surface. The glass exploded, shards flying like stars, and for a heartbeat, the room was silent. Then, something shifted. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and from its depths, a figure emerged, no longer the twisted Hollow Man, but a woman. Her eyes were hollow, but her face was hauntingly familiar. It was Sarah. Or rather, what was left of her. She reached out, voice fragile but chilling. The Hollow Man is not one creature. It is many. It is the fear in your father's eyes, the rage in a mother's heart, the silence in an abandoned home. It feeds on the broken, the lost, and it is hungry. Mark staggered back, horror flooding him. Memories crashed, the missing people, the faces twisted in terror, the voices in the wind. It chose me. It chose you. And now it's inside all of us. To fight it, you must look deeper, into the abyss within. The talisman's glow dimmed. Mark's reflection twisted again, merging with the woman's fading form. The Hollow Man's grin was everywhere, on the walls, in the shadows, in Mark's own eyes. A final choice loomed. Surrender, and become part of the darkness that swallowed Hollow Creek centuries ago. Or resist, facing the unbearable truth that the greatest horror was not outside, but within. Mark clenched the talisman, voice steady despite the terror. "I fight." The room shattered into a blinding storm of light and shadow. Time fractured, memories collided, and Mark plunged into the abyss, where the Hollow Man awaited, a swirling vortex of despair, 1,000 broken souls whispering his name. His scream tore through the void. And then, silence. The motel room was empty. The mirror lay shattered, the talisman cold and still on the floor. Outside, dawn broke over Hollow Creek, soft light spilling over the twisted trees. But in the deepest shadows, the Hollow Man's grin lingered, waiting for the next soul to wander too close to the edge.